Let's talk a little bit about expectations. I think we're all familiar with the sort of standard expectations that exist out there, sort of top down. So from someone of a higher socioeconomic status to lower, or a person with a greater responsibility having expectations on those that they're taking care of, or someone with a higher moral authority over those of lesser moral character. An easy example of that might be the parent-to-child relationship or employer-to-employee relationship. What most people don't think of, I think, is that there are expectations that go in the opposite direction as well. So, for instance, in the parent-child situation, yes, the parent has expectations of their children. You know, they do as they tell them to do, and that they don't do bad things, etc., etc. But the child actually has expectations in the other direction, whether or not they're really aware of it. So if the parent is sort of telling the child what to do, and to tell them that, you know, I'm charged with your care, so you'll do as I say. I have the responsibility here. I wear the pants. The child actually has an expectation that the parent is going to actually fulfill those duties, that the parent is going to be in control of the situation. The parent is going to protect them and feed them and provide them shelter. And a clear example of this, you know, whether the child is aware of it or not, is when the parent actually abdicates those responsibilities. So if you have an alcoholic parent, or absentee parent, or a parent who is working, say, several jobs, but is not home late at night when, you know, when the child is scared, you know, to be home alone, then you'll see these children acting out in various ways. And I think this is a clear indication that they've recognized that their expectations aren't being met. Similarly, in the employer-employee relationship, if certain expectations aren't being met, then an employee will seek other employment, or just become a really shitty employee, or may form a union, may attempt to unionize. Now, when it comes to the moral question, we have some expectations as well. If someone is going to come along and say they can account for morality and they have high moral standards, we have some expectations that they're going to some degree, live by those expectations. That they're not going to claim this high moral status and then, say if they're a member of the clergy, molest children. Or if they're just sort of a you know, everyday average apologist or Christian, that they're not going to treat everybody like shit that they meet. You know, these are sort of basic expectations. Now, when it comes to God, I think the expectation levels change, because what we're being told here is that this is an absolute being. And when it comes to, say, the average Christian, if that Christian were to treat everyone on message boards like shit, we might sort of think to ourselves, well, he does claim this high moral ground, but, you know, there's a possibility he's just dishonest, or doesn't have a lot of self-control, or maybe even his sanity comes into question. When it comes to God, though, we expect some consistency, mostly because of the claims that are made, right? The claims are that this is an absolute being. So when we talk about, say, for instance, the Ten Commandments, this sort of objective moral standards, we would expect God to abide by those standards as well. They can't be objective if they're not universally applied. They would have to apply, even if he is the moral lawgiver, they would still have to apply to him, essentially. So when it comes to some of the things that are attributed to God, they are not consistent with what we are told is God's character. And this poses a bit of a problem. Now, I think it's interesting that someone like Ray Comfort likes to accost people on the street and call them all kinds of names. Of course, he gets them to call themselves names, but he'll ask them if they've told a lie. And the person will say, yeah, I did tell a lie. I mean, it could be like 3 lies, right? And what is Ray going to say? Well, then you're a self-admitted liar. And a person would say, he would ask the person, have you ever looked at a woman with lust in your heart? And a person would say, well, yeah, man, I'm only human. And he would say, so you're an adulterer at heart. And have you ever used the Lord's name in vain? Well, yeah, sure. A moment of lack of self-control. Ah, so you're a blasphemer. So, of course, he goes on with this list. You're lying, murderous, adulterous, because, of course, hate, again, is murder in the heart. Lying, murderous, adulterer, blasphemer at heart, etc., etc. And so he'll characterize the entire person by those few little examples, which, obviously is disingenuous. You can't characterize an entire person's life only on the few negative aspects. And, I would venture to say that in proportion, let's say the proportion of lies told, the truths told in a person's lifetime is going to be relatively small. And but we're still going to characterize them as a liar. But if the apologist was being consistent, then I think when we turn that back to God, Richard Dawkins' famous quote, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, jealous and proud of it, etc., 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 that would actually be applicable. If we're going to be consistent here, I think if we're going to take Ray Comfort's approach, you would have to apply that to God. Now, why do I say this? I'm sure, I can hear already, why do you hate God so much? When it comes to looking at concepts and ideas, we first look at them, if we're going to be logical and rational about it, we're going to look first for internal inconsistencies. So we might say, here's a book, or here's someone claiming to be a married bachelor. Well, the first thing we would do is we would look at that and we would look for internal inconsistencies. And if we saw internal inconsistencies, then contradictions, then we would reject that. We'd say, well, John can't be a married bachelor. That's impossible. Now, if it just said, John is a rich bachelor, then we would say, well, I don't see anything there that's internally contradictory. Then we would move the concept out and look for the possibility that it might be contradict any other known idioms or axioms. When it comes to the God concept, if we're looking at consistency here and the expectations that a God who would say, thou shalt not murder, and then commands the murder of a bunch of people, well, then this is a bit of a problem. And I'm not going to go into all the contradictory characteristics. I think we're sort of all aware of them. This poses a problem. This poses a problem for belief in the first place. And you can even get more nuanced than that. I recently did a video where I talked about slavery and how all of God's major interventions are in the negative. He's always wipe out an entire tribe of people, flood the entire earth. Don't leave any of the men left standing, right? Kill, burn every building to the ground. And I would have expectations of all the wonderful, laudable characteristics that I'm told God has, including omnipotence, omnipresence, and omniscience, that he would be somewhat more eloquent in his solutions than that. I think this is a reasonable expectation, given all the wonderful things we're told about this deity, on top of the fact that we're also told that he so loves his creation. If God has all power and is an interventionist, or at least was an interventionist, and loves his creation, it is incongruous to think that his final solutions would be these mass horrible slaughters or the wiping out of all life on planet Earth, save for a few people and a couple animals on a boat. Obviously, the majority of life that he would have wiped out would be quote-unquote innocent life. This doesn't form an internally consistent concept, and therefore I think it's easily rejected. Now, I can already hear the Christian apologist or the everyday average Christian saying, who are you to have expectations of God? Or how dare you put God on trial? Au contraire. First off, I'm not putting God on trial. I'm assessing a concept. And that's an important thing. This is something you do in every aspect of your life, every other aspect. If you get a phone call from Ghana, Africa, from someone claiming to be an African princess with tens of millions of dollars, locked up in a bank account somewhere, and all you have to do is send $40,000 to unlock it and they'll give you half, you kind of view that with skepticism, don't you? This is something you do in every other aspect of your life. And this is the reason I have no respect for presuppositionalists. If you're going to presuppositionally accept a religion, you're just going to fall prey to the first salesman that comes along. And so, genetic fallacy aside, that's the reason why in Western countries a majority of people are Christians, and in Muslim countries a majority of people are Muslim. So yes, I'm going to have expectations of God. Not as an entity, but as a concept, before I decide that they exist as an entity. This is, after all, I'm being expected to submit not only my life, but apparently eternity to this being. I think I should make sure that it's at least internally consistent, and then maybe even externally consistent, before I accept the doctrine. So yes, for instance, I'm going to have some expectations that if God is claimed to be a just being, that his justice is going to make sense, right? That there's not going to be any sort of get out of jail free cards, but then everybody's going to claim that he's just. But more importantly, I'm going to expect consistency, because I'm told that this is an absolute being. So of course, when we talk about moral standards, the everyday average Christian is still human. They're still fallible. They're still subject to growth and change as a human being, betterment over time. And so if they make a mistake, we might say, well, he's only human. God is claimed to be an absolute being, a perfect being. And so I would expect nothing less than absolute consistency. And if I don't see absolute consistency, even one example, it's enough to reject the concept. One more thing I'd like to say in closing. As many of you are aware, I was raised more or less without any religion. And it wasn't until my mid-teens that I was exposed to even the concept of religion. And so in a way, I was exposed to all religions simultaneously. And so yes, I'm going to have some expectations, and I'm going to assess the concept at hand. But I'm not going to assess it based on my own sort of standards. I'm going to assess it based on the claimed attributes of the doctrine or the deity itself. And again, this is why I have a problem with presuppositionalism. In a way, I can kind of understand someone who was raised in that doctrine and then sort of over time sort of morphs into a presuppositionalist stance. But what I don't think they understand is what they're actually asking someone like me to do. I'm being asked not to analyze anything, not to put God on trial, not to assess anything and not to have any expectations, but rather to just accept the doctrine presuppositionally, and only then will I be invited to a Bible study class to take any of the incongruities in Scripture and mold them and shape them into a nice, palatable little morsel that can be more easily digested. And so, really, at this point, that becomes completely incoherent. And so, yes, when it comes right down to it, I'm going to have some expectations. Thanks for watching.